Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock usually meant the shift change for the 12 armed guards patrolling the iron perimeter of the Moretti estate, but for Lily Carter, it marked the start of a psychological torment that had nothing to do with the submachine guns tucked beneath Italian wool suits. She clutched her cleaning caddy to her chest like a riot shield as she navigated the massive marble foyer, her heart hammering against her ribs not because of the lethal men watching her every step, but because of the sound tearing through the heavy oak doors above. It was a desperate, gut-wrenching wail that echoed off the cold stone walls, a dual siren of pure agony that had been screaming for 4 hours straight today, 6 yesterday, and 7 the day before. At 27, Lily had survived a hellish marriage and the loss of her own son, yet in just 3 weeks of working here, she felt her resolve crumbling under the weight of that noise. Understanding exactly why the 6 maids before her had fled the mansion in sheer terror, she paused at the foot of the grand staircase, her fingers trembling as they unconsciously traced the jagged scar hidden beneath her sleeve, whispering a silent prayer for the 2 little girls who seemed to be fighting a war no one else could see. Then Gabriel Moretti appeared at the top of the landing, looking less like the ruthlessly efficient capo who controlled Chicago's entire underworld and more like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. At 36, he was a man who could dismantle rival cartels without blinking and had allegedly buried men for looking at him wrong, yet he stood there in a wrinkled suit that cost more than Lily's entire existence, utterly defeated by 2 tiny infants he couldn't comfort. Dark circles carved deep hollows beneath eyes that were usually sharp as flint, and he gripped the banister with white-knuckled desperation as the wails reached a fever pitch, making the crystal chandelier above him tremble. Harold, the loyal butler who had served the family for 25 years, stood beside him offering quiet pleas for rest, but Gabriel only laughed, a hollow, broken sound that scraped against the opulence of the hallway. "How can I rest, Harold, when my daughters are screaming like they are being tortured?" he asked, his voice cracking with a raw vulnerability that froze Lily in place. "I am a useless father who couldn't protect their mother, and now I can't even protect them from this." Lily watched the most dangerous man in the city crumble, and instead of fear, she felt a familiar ache bloom in her chest, the ghost of the son she never got to hold reaching out to the daughters who had no mother. She knew that look in Gabriel's eyes because she had worn it herself the night her ex-husband beat the life out of her unborn child, a helpless rage that burned hotter than any fire. Gabriel snatched his phone from his pocket to berate yet another specialist, shouting that he had already spent $10 million on neurologists and sleep therapists who offered nothing but useless excuses while his children suffered. He slammed the device against the wall with enough force to crack the plaster, the violence of the action making the guards flinch, but Lily didn't move, her instincts screaming louder than her fear. She knew this wasn't about medicine or money or power, but about a grief so profound it had infected the very air of the house, and as the cries upstairs turned into choking sobs, she realized she couldn't just stand there and clean the floors while those babies drowned in sorrow. The shattered remains of the phone lay scattered across the Persian rug like modern art born of violence, yet the destruction offered Gabriel no relief from the torment echoing down the grand staircase. He stared at his trembling hand as if it belonged to a stranger, his chest heaving with the exertion of a rage that had nowhere to go, while the 12 armed guards by the entrance averted their gazes with the practiced discipline of men who knew that witnessing a king's weakness was more dangerous than facing his enemies. Harold moved silently to collect the debris, his face etched with a sorrow that went beyond professional duty, placing the jagged pieces into his pocket as he murmured a soft apology that Gabriel didn't hear. The Mafia boss turned his back on the wreckage of his composure, running a hand through his disheveled hair as he looked up toward the nursery where his legacy was currently screaming itself hoarse. He had conquered the Chicago underworld, silenced witnesses, and brokered peace treaties with cartels that skinned men alive, but he could not negotiate with the grief of 2 4-month-old infants who wanted a mother he had failed to keep alive. Gabriel walked past Lily without seeing her, his presence a wave of cold air and expensive cologne mixed with the stale scent of whiskey, and he disappeared into his study, the heavy oak door slamming shut with a finality that made the crystal vases on the console table rattle. Lily finally exhaled the breath she had been holding, her fingers uncurling from the handle of her cleaning caddy, but the relief was short-lived as the wailing upstairs pitched higher into a frantic, breathless rhythm that clawed at the inside of her skull. She knew she should move, should fade back into the shadows and scrub the marble until her knees bruised, but her feet felt leaden, anchored by the ghostly weight of a memory she had spent 2 years trying to outrun. The agony in those cries was not just the fussing of spoiled children, it was the primal, terrifying sound of abandonment. A language Lily spoke fluently because she had screamed it herself on the floor of a bathroom while her ex-husband wiped her blood from his knuckles. She forced herself into motion, pushing the cart toward the service hallway, trying to focus on the task of polishing the already gleaming banisters, but the sound followed her like a physical specter. It had been 3 weeks of this torture, 3 weeks of watching a powerful man disintegrate while his staff walked on eggshells, terrified that the lack of sleep would turn the Dawn's volatile temper into a bloodbath. Lily kept her head down as she worked, her mind drifting dangerously to the small, cold apartment in the slums where she lived, and the terrifying letter she had found slipped under her door just this morning. The debt Derek had left her with was not merely numbers on a page, but a death sentence signed by the invisible hand of the loan sharks, a staggering $500,000 that grew with predatory interest every time she blinked. She needed this job more than she needed air, which meant she had to be invisible, efficient, and deaf to the suffering of the Moretti family, because one mistake could send her back to the streets where collectors broke legs for missed payments. Yet, as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere in the mansion thickened into a suffocating gray fog of despair that seemed to dim the very sunlight streaming through the high windows. The other staff moved like zombies, their eyes rimmed with red from the noise pollution that penetrated every wall, and even the stern-faced guards outside seemed to shift uncomfortably as the screams drifted into the courtyard. Lily found herself pausing outside the library, her polishing cloth stilled on the mahogany, as she listened to the muffled sound of glass shattering from within Gabriel's study, followed by a silence that was somehow louder than the shouting. He was drowning in there, drowning in guilt and whiskey, while his daughters drowned in sorrow upstairs, and the symmetry of their pain made Lily's chest ache with a phantom maternal pull she thought had been beaten out of her. She touched the scar on her arm again, the raised tissue feeling hot against her fingertips, and remembered the weight of the son she never held, the son whose name she whispered into her pillow on the nights the grief became too heavy to carry alone. By 3:30, the crying had devolved into jagged, exhausting gasps that sounded painfully like a dying animal, and Lily found her feet carrying her not toward the service elevator, but toward the grand staircase. She told herself she was just going to clean the hallway outside the nursery, to do her job and earn the paycheck that kept the wolves from her door, but her heart knew she was lying. She moved up the carpeted steps, the portraits of dead Moretti ancestors watching her with judgmental oil-painted eyes, and with every step, the sound of the twins grew more distinct, morphing from a noise into a plea. She reached the second-floor landing just as Harold emerged from the nursery, his usually pristine uniform rumpled and his face pale, looking as if he had just gone 12 rounds with a prize fighter. He didn't scold her for being out of her zone. He simply leaned against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment, the mask of the perfect butler slipping to reveal a tired old man who loved these children and had no idea how to save them. "The doctor is coming again in an hour," Harold whispered to no one in particular, opening his eyes to look at Lily with a gaze that held no hope, only resignation. "Go inside and clean the changing area, girl. The nurses are taking a break in the adjoining room before they collapse. The babies are in their cribs, though I doubt they will stay there long." Lily nodded, her throat too dry to speak, and gripped her cleaning supplies with white-knuckled intensity as she approached the pale pink door decorated with silver stars. It looked like the entrance to a fairy tale, but as she pushed the handle down, the air that rushed out to meet her smelled of distress, stale formula, and the sharp, antiseptic scent of a hospital room disguised as a nursery. She stepped across the threshold into the dim light, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the afternoon sun, and saw the 2 cribs standing like islands in the center of the room. Bella and Sophia were there, their tiny bodies writhing in a misery so profound it sucked the oxygen from the room, and as Lily looked at them, the terrifying realization washed over her that she was the only person in this house who wasn't afraid of their pain, because she was the only one who had already lost everything that mattered. The nursery was a shrine to a happiness that had never arrived, filled with untouched stuffed animals and a silence that felt heavy and expectant until the door burst open and the screaming shattered the peace. Lily had been dusting the high shelf where a collection of crystal figurines mocked the chaos of the house, but the sudden intrusion made her flinch, her elbow connecting with a heavy glass bottle of imported rose perfume. It tumbled in slow motion, crashing against the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed louder than a gunshot, sending shards of glass and the cloying scent of artificial flowers exploding across the room just as Gabriel Moretti stormed in. He looked like a man possessed, his tie undone and his eyes wild with a mixture of sleeplessness and fury, carrying a purple-faced fellow while Harold struggled with a wailing Sophia behind him. "What is this?" Gabriel roared, his voice rough with the kind of exhaustion that made men dangerous, staring at the broken glass as if it were a personal insult. But Lily didn't cower as she usually did. She dropped to her knees to gather the shards, yet her eyes were locked on Bella, whose tiny chest was heaving with gasps that sounded terrifyingly like a breathless goodbye. The instinct that surged through Lily wasn't rational, born of a mother's grief for the son she had buried in her heart, and before she could stop herself, she reached out, her bloodied hands hovering just inches from the hem of the baby's blanket. "Let me," she whispered, the words tearing from her throat with a desperation that matched the room's energy. "Please, sir, let me hold her." Gabriel froze, the fight draining out of him as he looked from the mess on the floor to the woman kneeling in it, and for a second, he looked less like a dawn and more like a drowning man spotting a lifeline. He didn't argue or shout. He simply leaned down and placed the screaming infant into Lily's arms, surrendering his daughter to the maid because he had nothing left to give. The moment Bella's weight settled against Lily's chest, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Lily began to hum a low, vibrating melody she had written for a ghost named Michael, rocking her body in a rhythm as old as time while the scent of roses and milk enveloped them. And then, the impossible happened. The silence that followed was so absolute it hurt the ears. Bella's cries cut off as if a switch had been flipped, her tear-filled eyes widening to stare at Lily before fluttering shut, succumbing to the sleep she had fought for months. Harold stood paralyzed in the doorway, Sophia having quieted in sympathy, while Gabriel stared at Lily with an expression that bordered on religious awe. But the awe quickly hardened back into the calculating gaze of a businessman who had just found a solution to his most pressing problem. 2 hours later, Lily sat across from him in his study, the air thick with the smell of leather and power, as he slid a thick manila folder across the mahogany desk. "I had you investigated," Gabriel said, his voice devoid of the earlier hysteria, replaced by the cold steel of the capo. He opened the file to reveal a photograph of Derek and a balance sheet that made Lily's blood run cold. $500,000. That is what your ex-husband owes the Sharks, and by extension, what you owe. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, watching her panic rise. "I will pay it. All of it. And I will ensure Derek Lawson never breathes in your direction again." He paused, letting the magnitude of the offer sink in. "In exchange, you don't just clean my floors. You become their mother in everything but blood. You live here, you breathe for them, and you make sure this house never sounds like hell again." The transformation of the Moretti estate did not happen with a bang, but with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight had been lifted from the very foundation of the house. For the first time in months, the sun seemed to penetrate the heavy velvet drapes of the nursery, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air as Lily sat in the rocking chair, her head tipped back in exhaustion while Bella and Sophia slept soundly in their cribs. Gabriel watched the scene not from the doorway, but from the bank of high-definition security monitors in his basement command center, a glass of amber whiskey untouched in his hand as the blue light of the screens washed over his sharpened features. He had stopped looking like a ghost. The stubble was gone, replaced by the clean-shaven jaw of a man who commanded armies, and the wrinkled suits had been exchanged for his signature tailored charcoal wool that cost more than most people earned in a year. Yet, the ruthless capo of Chicago found himself paralyzed by the grainy image of the nanny who had achieved the impossible, his eyes tracing the curve of her neck and the protective way her hand rested near the crib even in her sleep. He told himself it was merely asset protection, that he was guarding the only solution to his daughter's suffering. But the tightening in his chest when he saw her flinch in a nightmare suggested that Lily Carter had become something far more dangerous to his carefully constructed walls than a simple employee. Life inside the mansion settled into a rhythm that was deceptively peaceful, a golden cage where the bars were made of luxury, and the lock was the constant presence of armed men in the garden. Lily moved through this world with a quiet grace, her initial terror fading into a cautious comfort as she realized that the monsters in suits were less terrifying than the monster she had married. She would wake at dawn to prepare bottles, her humming drifting through the hallways like a balm, and by breakfast, she would often find Gabriel lingering in the kitchen, a place he hadn't set foot in for years. He didn't say much, his communication limited to curt nods or questions about the twins, but his actions screamed of a man trying to relearn how to be human. He would leave stacks of cash on the counter for baby supplies that far exceeded any budget, or she would turn around to find him watching her feed Sophia. His dark eyes filled with a hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with the peace she radiated. It was a fragile, unspoken truce, a domesticity built on the edge of a cliff, and neither of them dared to look down for fear of breaking the spell. However, the peace within the walls of the estate only served to sharpen the knives of those watching from the outside. Victoria Ashford sat in her pristine Mercedes, parked just outside the iron gates, her knuckles white as she gripped the leather steering wheel, watching Gabriel's motorcade leave for the city. She had been the Moretti family doctor for 5 years, a position she had cultivated with surgical precision, intending to step into the role of Gabriel's wife the moment the grieving period for his late wife ended. She was beautiful, wealthy, and had the pedigree to match a Mafia king, yet for 4 months, he had looked right through her, consumed by the twins' agony. Now, the agony was gone, replaced by a mousy little maid with a scar on her arm and a background in the gutter, and Victoria could feel her carefully laid plans unraveling with every report she received from the inside staff she had bribed. She wasn't a woman who lost, she was a woman who excised tumors, and as she watched Lily walk past a window with a sleeping baby on her shoulder, looking for all the world like the lady of the house, Victoria decided it was time to cut the cancer out before it spread any further. The dive bar on the south side of Chicago smelled of stale beer, urine, and despair, a sharp contrast to the sterile, antiseptic world Victoria inhabited, yet she walked through the haze of cigarette smoke with her chin held high, her expensive trench coat drawing hungry eyes from the shadows. She found him in the back booth, a man who looked like he had been chewed up and spat out by life, nursing a cheap whiskey with a shaking hand. Derek Lawson was a ruin of a human being, his face puffy from alcohol and his eyes burning with a perpetual, directionless rage, but to Victoria, he looked like the perfect scalpel. She slid into the booth opposite him, ignoring the sticky table, and placed a sleek black clutch in front of her like a barrier between her world and his. Derek looked up, a sneer forming on his cracked lips as he took in her jewelry and the air of superiority that clung to her like perfume. "You lost, lady," he rasped, his voice a grater against her ears. "The country club is about 20 miles north." Victoria didn't smile. She simply opened the clutch and slid a photograph across the table, watching Derek's eyes widen as he recognized the woman holding the twins in the garden of a mansion he could only dream of robbing. "I am not lost, Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice smooth and cold as liquid nitrogen. "I am exactly where I need to be. I believe you have been looking for your wife. It seems she has moved up in the world while you have been rotting here." Derek snatched the photo, his knuckles turning white as he stared at Lily, his face twisting into a mask of possessive hatred that made Victoria's stomach turn, though she hid it well. "She thinks she can hide from me," he growled, spitting on the floor. "She thinks she is better than me because she is sleeping in a castle now?" "She is not just sleeping there," Victoria corrected, leaning forward to lower her voice, her eyes locking onto his. "She is erasing you. She is living a life of luxury while you drown in debt. But I can change that." She reached into her bag again, this time pulling out a thick envelope that landed on the table with a heavy, satisfying thud. Derek stared at it, the greed warring with the anger in his bloodshot eyes. "There is $20,000 in there as a down payment," Victoria whispered, the devil on his shoulder. "And there is another $180,000 waiting for you. $200,000, Derek. Enough to clear your debts, buy a new life, and remind your wife who really owns her." Derek licked his lips, his hand hovering over the envelope, his moral compass having shattered years ago. "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice trembling with anticipation. Victoria smiled then, a cold, terrifying expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing yet," she said softly. "Just be ready. I am going to flush her out of that house, and when she lands on the street, broken and alone, she is all yours." Thursday morning arrived with a steel-gray sky that mirrored the churning unease in Gabriel's gut as he stood by the idling motorcade, his hand lingering on the door handle of the armored SUV. He had a unification treaty to sign in New York, a deal that would secure his family's borders for a decade, yet the capo of Chicago found himself paralyzed by the sight of Lily standing in the nursery window, holding Sophia's hand as they waved goodbye. He had spent his entire life trusting no one, building walls of silence and violence to survive, but as he looked at the woman who had brought the first real sleep to his home in months, he realized with a terrifying clarity that he was leaving his heart unguarded in that house. "I will be back in 48 hours, he told Tony, his voice rougher than usual, the command sounding more like a plea to the universe than an order to his head of security. "If she needs anything at all, you give it to her." The mansion felt hollow the moment the heavy gates swung shut behind him, and Lily tried to fill the silence by humming her lullabies, unaware that the snake was already coiling at the door. Victoria Ashford arrived at noon, sweeping into the foyer with her medical bag and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, announcing that it was time for the twins' monthly development check. Lily, intimidated by the doctor's immaculate appearance and the easy familiarity she had with the staff, stepped back to let her pass, feeling like an imposter in her own domain. "You look exhausted, dear," Victoria noted with faux concern, her eyes scanning the nursery with the precision of a predator assessing a trap. "Why don't you take Sophia to the guest room for her nap? I need to examine Bella's reflexes in a quiet environment, and twins tend to distract each other." Lily hesitated, her instinct prickling, but Victoria was the expert, the woman Gabriel trusted with his children's lives, so she nodded obediently and lifted Sophia, leaving Bella cooing innocently in her crib. The moment the door clicked shut, Victoria's professional mask dissolved into a mask of cold, calculating malice. She moved with practiced speed, retrieving a small vial of clear liquid and a syringe from her bag, her hands steady as she drew a precise, dangerous dose of a powerful prescription sedative. "Sleep tight, little princess," she whispered, the needle piercing Bella's soft skin before the baby could even whimper. The infant's eyes widened in shock, then glazed over, her limbs growing heavy as the drug flooded her tiny system. Victoria didn't linger to watch. She wiped the injection site, capped the needle, and slipped into the hallway, moving silently toward Lily's bedroom at the end of the corridor. She lifted the mattress of the modest bed, shoved the half-empty vial of sedatives underneath, and smoothed the sheets, planting the seed of destruction that would shatter Gabriel's world. 2 hours later, the silence in the nursery had curdled into something wrong, a thick, suffocating stillness that made the hair on Lily's arms stand up as she walked back in. She approached Bella's crib expecting to see the rhythmic rise and fall of breathing, but instead, she found the baby lying awkwardly still, her skin a terrifying shade of pale gray. "Bella," Lily whispered, reaching out to touch her, but the skin was cold and clammy, and the baby was limp, a ragdoll in a nightmare that wouldn't end. Panic detonated in Lily's chest, ripping a scream from her throat that echoed through the mansion, bringing Harold and the guards running. "She won't wake up," Lily sobbed, shaking the baby gently, desperate for a cry, a movement, anything. Call the ambulance. Please, God, call the ambulance. Gabriel tore through the hospital doors 4 hours later, his suit rumpled from the flight he had forced the pilot to make in record time, his face a mask of terrifying fury that made the nurses scatter. He found his daughter hooked up to monitors, her tiny body dwarfed by tubes, and Victoria standing by the bedside, holding a weeping Harold's hand. It was an overdose, Gabriel, Victoria said softly, her voice laced with sorrow as she looked at him with tear-filled eyes. Benzodiazepines. A massive dose. The doctors pumped her stomach, but who would have access to something like that? She let the question hang in the air, a poisonous vapor, before adding, I noticed Lily acting strange earlier. Disoriented. Maybe we should check her room. The phone call from Tony came 5 minutes later, a death knell ringing in Gabriel's ear as he stood in the sterile hallway, watching Lily weep through the glass of the waiting room. Boss, Tony's voice was grim. We searched the nanny's room. We found a vial of prescription sedatives under her mattress. It matches what the doctors found in Bella's blood. The world tilted on its axis for Gabriel, the trust he had started to build shattering into a million jagged shards of betrayal. The trauma of his wife's poisoning, the years of paranoia, the fear, it all coalesced into a blinding white rage that erased the man who had started to love Lily and left only the monster. He stormed into the waiting room, grabbing Lily by the arm with enough force to bruise, dragging her toward the exit as she screamed in confusion. Gabriel, please. I don't know what happened, she begged, her feet skidding on the hospital linoleum, but he didn't hear her. He only heard the flat line of his trust. He shoved her out the automatic doors into the pouring rain, the water soaking her instantly as she fell to the pavement. You poisoned my daughter, he roared, his voice shaking the very air, his eyes black pits of hatred. I gave you a home. I gave you a life. And you tried to kill her. Lily tried to crawl toward him, to beg, to explain, but he stepped back, looking at her as if she were a disease. Get out of my sight, he spat, the words cutting deeper than any knife. If I ever see you near my family again, I will not just ruin you. I will bury you. The Chicago storm did not discriminate between the innocent and the guilty, lashing against Lily's skin with the force of 1,000 icy needles as she stumbled through the transition from the manicured lawns of Lake Forest to the cracked pavement of the West Side. She had been walking for 2 hours, her expensive nanny uniform now a sodden, clinging second skin that marked her as an outsider in the slums she used to call home. Yet the physical cold was nothing compared to the freezing void Gabriel's words had left in her chest. Every time she blinked, she saw his face twisted in that terrifying mixture of hatred and betrayal, heard the accusation that she had tried to kill the only thing she loved, and the injustice of it buckled her knees more effectively than the gale force wind. She had no phone, no money, and no coat, only the phantom sensation of Bella's limp body in her arms and the crushing realization that the golden cage had not just unlocked, but had ejected her straight into the mouth of the wolf. The apartment building loomed out of the darkness like a rotting tooth, the streetlights buzzing intermittently over the graffiti-stained brickwork that smelled of wet garbage and despair. Lily climbed the stairs with legs that felt made of lead, her breath hitching in her bruised throat, but when she reached the 4th floor, her heart stopped dead in her chest. The door to 4B was not just unlocked, it was hanging off its hinges, the wood splintered around the lock plate in a violent testament to forced entry that screamed of a danger she knew intimately. She should have run, should have turned back into the storm and taken her chances with the hypothermia, yet a fatalistic exhaustion pinned her to the spot, a sense that destiny was done playing games and had finally come to collect. She stepped over the threshold into the gloom, and the smell hit her instantly, stale beer, cheap cigarettes, and the metallic tang of unwashed aggression. Derek Lawson sat on the ruins of her small sofa like a king on a throne of filth, his boots resting on the overturned coffee table as he cleaned his fingernails with a hunting knife. He looked up the moment she entered, his eyes glassy with a chemical glaze that told her he had already spent a portion of Victoria's blood money, and a slow, terrifying grin spread across his face that made Lily's blood turn to ice. The princess returns, he slurred, standing up with a deceptive unsteadiness that vanished as he lunged across the room, grabbing a handful of her wet hair before she could even back away. He dragged her into the center of the room, throwing her to the floor with a force that knocked the wind out of her lungs and loomed over her, blocking out the dim light from the hallway. "Did he throw you out, Lily? Did your rich boyfriend finally realize you are nothing but trash wrapped in a pretty uniform?" Lily tried to scramble backward, her hands slipping on the linoleum, but Derek was faster, his boot connecting with her ribs in a sickening crunch that turned her vision white. He didn't just beat her, he dismantled her, pouring years of inadequacy and resentment into every blow, screaming about how she had humiliated him by running away, how she thought she was better than him because she slept in a mansion while he hid from loan sharks. "You think you are special?" he roared, hauling her up by her collar only to smash his fist into her cheekbone, the sound of bone meeting bone echoing in the small room. "You are worth nothing unless someone pays for you." And guess what? Someone finally paid. He laughed then, a manic sound that mixed with the thunder outside, taunting her with the knowledge that her destruction had been purchased, that she was merely a transaction in a game played by people much more powerful than she would ever be. The violence went on until Derek was panting with exertion, his knuckles split and bloody, while Lily lay curled in a fetal position on the cold floor, unable to move, unable to scream, her consciousness flickering like a dying bulb. He crouched down beside her, rifling through her pockets until he found the nothingness she possessed, then spat on her broken form with a finality that hurt more than the kicks. "Don't worry about the debt," he whispered, his hot breath smelling of rot against her ear. "It is settled. You paid it tonight." He stood up, wiped his hands on his jeans as if he had just taken out the trash, and walked out of the apartment, leaving the door wide open to the storm. Silence reclaimed the room, broken only by the ragged, bubbling sound of Lily's breathing as she lay amidst the wreckage of her past life. The rain blew in through the open door, mixing with the blood pooling beneath her head, but she couldn't feel the cold anymore. She couldn't feel anything except a heavy, dark gravity pulling her down through the floorboards. She thought of Bella and Sophia, of the way their tiny hands felt wrapped around her finger, and wondered if Gabriel would tell them she had loved them, or if he would let them grow up hating her name. Darkness began to creep in from the edges of her vision, a welcome blanket to cover the pain, and she closed her eyes, ready to let go, ready to finally stop running. It was Mrs. Kovacs from down the hall who found her 20 minutes later, the elderly woman's scream piercing the veil of unconsciousness just before the sirens began to wail in the distance, signaling that Lily Carter was not going to be allowed the mercy of dying just yet. The silence that Gabriel had exiled along with the nanny did not last even an hour, replaced by a screaming that was louder, sharper, and more desperate than before, tearing through the mansion like a physical wound that refused to close. Harold paced the corridor outside the nursery, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, listening to the new agency nurses failing to comfort the twins, and he felt a cold knot of suspicion tightening in his gut that had nothing to do with the late hour. He had served the Moretti family for 25 years, seeing them through wars and weddings, and he prided himself on knowing the character of those allowed within these walls. Lily Carter had loved those children with a fierceness that did not align with the cold-blooded poisoner Victoria described. Unable to ignore the gnawing wrongness of the situation, the old butler descended to the security control room at 3 in the morning, bypassing the dozing guard to sit before the bank of monitors, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled up the archived footage from the afternoon. The timestamp read 12:14 when Victoria entered the nursery, and Harold watched with narrowing eyes as she ushered Lily out with a smile that looked predatory even in grainy black and white. For 20 minutes, the doctor was alone with Bella, but she didn't check reflexes or listen to a heartbeat. Instead, the camera captured her reaching into her bag, withdrawing a syringe, and leaning over the crib with a chilling efficiency that made Harold's blood run cold. Yet the damning moment came 10 minutes later, when Victoria left the nursery and walked not toward the stairs, but down the hallway to the servants' quarters, slipping into Lily's room and emerging 3 minutes later empty-handed. Harold froze the frame, the image of the doctor exiting the room where the drugs were found burning into his retina, and he realized with a sickening lurch that they had been played for fools, manipulated by a woman whose ambition had turned her into a monster. Tony Russo pushed open the heavy door to the security room just as Harold was printing the still image, the head of security looking as haggard as the butler felt. "You feel it too?" Tony asked, his voice rough with lack of sleep, tossing a crumpled pharmacy receipt onto the console table. "I tracked the lot number on the sedative vial found under the mattress. It wasn't stolen from a hospital supply closet. It was purchased 3 days ago from a private pharmacy in the Loop." He tapped the paper with a callous finger. "Paid for by a shell account linked to the Ashford Family Trust. And that is not the worst of it." Tony pulled out a tablet, swiping through a series of decrypted text messages he had pulled from the cloud server of Victoria's secondary phone. "I found communication with a burner number registered to a cell tower in the West Side slums. She sent a wire transfer for $200,000 to Derek Lawson 2 hours before the boss came home." The walk to Gabriel's study felt like a funeral procession, the weight of the truth heavier than any coffin Harold had ever carried. They found Gabriel sitting in the dark, illuminated only by the dying embers of the fireplace, a bottle of scotch nearly empty on the desk and his head in his hands as the screams from upstairs filtered down through the floorboards. He looked up as they entered, his eyes bloodshot and hollow, carrying the look of a man who had executed his own soul. "If you are here to tell me they are still crying, I know," Gabriel rasped, his voice a ruin. "Get out." But Harold didn't move. Instead, he stepped into the light and placed the security photo, the pharmacy receipt, and the tablet on the desk in front of the most dangerous man in Chicago. "We are not here about the children, Sir," Harold said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "We are here because we have made a catastrophic mistake. Lily did not poison your daughter. Victoria did." Gabriel stared at the evidence, the words not registering at first, his mind rejecting the possibility that his reality could fracture twice in one day. But then he saw the timestamp of Victoria entering Lily's room, read the text message where Victoria told Derek to make sure she never comes back in exchange for the second installment of the $200,000, and the air left the room. The glass in his hand shattered, slicing into his palm, but he didn't feel the pain. He only felt the crushing, suffocating weight of guilt that threatened to stop his heart. He had looked into the eyes of the woman who saved his children, the woman who had trusted him, and he had called her a monster before throwing her to the wolves. He had unknowingly handed her over to the very man she had spent years running from, paid for by the woman he had allowed into his home. "Where is she?" Gabriel whispered, the question coming out as a strangled plea, standing up so abruptly his chair crashed backward. "Tony, where is Lily?" The silence that stretched between the two men was terrified and absolute. Tony looked down at his boots, unable to meet his boss's gaze, before finally speaking in a voice devoid of hope. "The police scanner picked up a 911 call from her old apartment building an hour ago, boss. A neighbor reported a domestic assault." Tony swallowed hard. "She is in the ICU at Cook County. Massive internal bleeding. Broken ribs. The doctors, they don't know if she is going to make it through the night." The roar that tore from Gabriel's throat was not human. It was the sound of a predator realizing it had slaughtered its own mate, a sound that promised a violence so absolute it would burn the city to the ground. "Bring me Victoria," he ordered, his voice dropping to a terrifying calm that was far worse than the shouting. "Do not let her speak. Do not let her call a lawyer. Drag her to the basement and keep her alive until I get back. I have to go to the hospital." The sterile, biting scent of antiseptic and floor wax hit Gabriel Moretti like a physical blow as he pushed through the double doors of the intensive care unit, a sharp contrast to the sense of leather and cigar smoke that usually defined his existence. He walked with the heavy, frantic strides of a man marching to his own execution, ignoring the terrified nurses who scattered like pigeons before his approaching storm, his eyes fixed solely on the glass wall of room 402. He had ordered men to their deaths without blinking, had watched empires crumble and cities burn, yet his hand trembled uncontrollably as he reached for the metal door handle, paralyzed by the terrifying knowledge that the carnage waiting on the other side was entirely his own creation. The beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic accusation that synced with the thudding of his own guilt as he stepped inside and saw what was left of Lily Carter. She looked small, swallowed by the stark white sheets and the tangle of tubes that tethered her to life. Her face, the face he had started to look for every morning, reduced to a map of violence. One eye was swollen shut, the skin turning a sickly shade of purple and green, while her lip was split and stitched, and a heavy cast encased her arm, suspended against her chest like a broken wing. Gabriel felt the bile rise in his throat, a visceral reaction to the brutality that mirrored the rage he felt toward Derek Lawson, but the rage was quickly drowned by a suffocating wave of self-hatred because he knew, with sickening clarity, that Derek had been the weapon, but he had been the one to pull the trigger. He had unlocked the gate, stripped her of her protection, and thrown her into the dark, and seeing the rise and fall of her chest, ragged and pained even in sleep, felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Lily stirred then, pulled from the darkness by the presence of the predator in the room, and her one good eye fluttered open, glassy with pain medication and confusion until it focused on him standing at the foot of the bed. The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. She didn't smile, didn't reach out. She flinched. She tried to curl into herself, a wounded animal retreating from the boot that had kicked it, a whimper of pure, distilled fear escaping her throat as she raised her uninjured hand to shield her face. That small, instinctive movement shattered Gabriel Moretti more completely than any bullet ever could. It stripped away the capo, the businessman, the king of Chicago, leaving only a man who realized he had become the very monster he had sworn to protect her from. He didn't speak, didn't try to defend himself or offer excuses that would sound like ashes in his mouth. Instead, the most feared man in the city did the unthinkable. He walked around the side of the bed, ignoring the dirt on the linoleum floor, and sank to his knees. The expensive fabric of his charcoal suit absorbed the grime of a public hospital as he bowed his head, his forehead resting against the cold metal rail of her bed, his shoulders shaking with a silent, racking sob he could no longer suppress. "I am sorry," he choked out, the words tearing from his throat, raw and bleeding. "I know the truth. I know it was Victoria. I know I broke my promise." He didn't dare look up, didn't dare ask for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve, simply kneeling in the debris of his mistakes while the machines beeped on, marking the seconds of his penance. Lily stared down at the dark head of the man who had destroyed her life, her heart hammering against her broken ribs with a mixture of terror and confusion. She had expected shouting, accusations, or perhaps the final blow, but seeing the proud, arrogant Gabriel Moretti on his knees, broken and weeping, short-circuited her fear just enough to let the pain seep back in. "You threw me out," she whispered, her voice a raspy shadow of itself, catching on the tears that leaked from her swollen eye. "You told me you would kill me." Gabriel flinched as if she had struck him, slowly lifting his head to look at her with eyes that were red-rimmed and desperate. "I was a fool," he admitted, his voice low and intense. "I was blind. But I swear to you, on the lives of my daughters, I will spend the rest of my existence making this right. Victoria is gone. Derek is gone. You are safe, Lily. Please, just tell me what you need." "I need you to leave," she said, closing her eye, the exhaustion pulling her back down. "I can't go back there. I can't trust you." The rejection hit him like a physical impact, final and absolute, and for a moment, Gabriel thought he had truly lost her. But he had one card left to play, a cruel but necessary manipulation born of desperation. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen for a heartbeat before he pressed play. The sound that filled the hospital room was not music, but the gut-wrenching, hoarse screaming of Bella and Sophia, a recording Harold had sent him an hour ago. It was the sound of pure abandonment, of two babies who had stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and were slowly grieving themselves into sickness. Lily's eyes flew open, the maternal instinct that Derek hadn't been able to beat out of her surging to the surface, overriding the pain in her body. She tried to sit up, gasping as her ribs protested, her hand reaching out blindly toward the phone. "My babies," she sobbed, the sound tearing at Gabriel's heart even as he hated himself for using it. "Are they okay? Tell me they're okay." Gabriel shut off the recording, leaning forward to gently take her hand, his touch light as a feather, terrified of hurting her further. "They are not okay," he said softly, looking deep into her eyes. "They haven't slept since you left. They won't eat. They need you, Lily. I am not asking for me. I am begging for them. Come back. Not as a servant. As their mother. I will stay away from you if that is what you want. I will sleep in the guest house. I will never touch you again. But please, save my daughters." It took 3 days for the doctors to clear her for transport, 3 days where Gabriel stood guard outside her door like a sentinel, refusing to leave even to shower, ensuring that no shadow fell upon her room. When the private ambulance finally brought her back to the Moretti estate, it was not a triumphant return, but a somber procession. She was carried up to the nursery in a wheelchair, her cast stark white against the dark wood of the hallway, and the moment she entered the room, the screaming stopped. It was instant, just like the first time. Bella and Sophia, red-faced and exhausted, went silent the second they saw her, reaching out with chubby arms through the bars of their cribs. Lily wept as she held them as best she could with one arm, burying her face in their soft bellies, whispering promises that she would never leave them again. Weeks bled into a month, and the mansion slowly began to heal around the scars of the past. Lily recovered in the guest suite next to the nursery, her bruises fading into yellow memories, while Gabriel kept his word, observing her from a distance, a silent guardian who ensured her world was filled with favorite foods, soft blankets, and absolute safety. But while domestic peace returned to the estate, the world outside was shifting. The Castellano family, an old rival clan that Gabriel had decimated years ago to seize the territory, had been watching the chaos from the shadows. They saw the doctor's arrest, the chaos at the hospital, and most importantly, they saw the weakness Gabriel Moretti had finally exposed. He had a heart now, living and breathing inside his fortress, and for the Castellanos, who were hungry to reclaim their lost empire, Lily Carter and her Aunt Margaret were not people. They were the keys to the kingdom, and the lock was about to be broken. The peace that had settled over the Moretti estate was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the vibrating hum of a cell phone left on the garden table, a sound that cut through the laughter of the twins like a warning siren. Lily reached for it, expecting a call from the pediatrician, but the voice on the other end was a rasp of wet gravel that froze the blood in her veins. It was the head of the Castellano family, a rival clan Gabriel had decimated years ago, and he wasn't calling to negotiate. He was calling to let her hear the terrified whimpers of her Aunt Margaret. He didn't yell or summon his army immediately. Instead, he looked at Lily with a devastation that broke her heart, realizing that his world of violence had once again breached the sanctuary he had tried to build for her. "I will bring her back," he vowed, his voice low and devoid of the tremors that shook his hands when he held his daughters, stripped of all emotion save for a lethal resolve. He grabbed Lily's arm, not to throw her out this time, but to pull her toward the hidden panel in the library wall that led to the panic room. "You stay here. You lock this door from the inside, and you do not open it for anyone but me or Harold. If I am not back by dawn, Tony has instructions to get you and the girls to Switzerland." Lily grabbed his lapels, her tears soaking into his silk shirt, begging him not to go, to pay the money but not give himself up. Yet Gabriel only kissed her forehead with the tenderness of a man saying goodbye to soul. "I broke you once, Lily," he whispered against her hair. "I will burn the whole city down before I let them break you again." The textile factory smelled of rust and the stagnant river water that lapped against the rotting pilings, a graveyard of industry that the Castellanos had chosen for their revenge. Gabriel walked into the center of the cavernous floor alone, a black duffel bag containing $20 million hanging heavy in his hand, while 6 armed men emerged from the shadows with weapons trained on his chest. At the far end, Aunt Margaret was tied to a chair, a gun pressed to her temple by the Castellano underboss, her eyes wide with the terror of a woman who had never known this kind of darkness. Gabriel dropped the bag, the thud echoing in the silence. "The money is there. "Let her go," he commanded, his stance relaxed, his eyes scanning the rafters where he knew the snipers would be. The underboss laughed, a jagged sound, and kicked the bag aside. "We don't just want the money, Moretti. We want the king of Chicago on his knees." But Gabriel Moretti did not kneel for men like them. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, and the skylights above shattered as Tony and his elite tactical team repelled into the chaos, turning the execution site into a war zone. Gunfire erupted in a deafening cacophony, bullets chewing through concrete and flesh alike. Gabriel didn't dive for cover. He sprinted toward Margaret, moving through the hail of lead with a singular, suicidal focus. He saw the underboss raise his weapon, not at him, but at the terrifyingly fragile woman in the chair, intending to hurt Gabriel by destroying what he had promised to save. Gabriel threw himself across the last few meters, his body colliding with Margaret's chair just as the gun flashed. The impact of the bullet spinning him around felt like a sledgehammer to the chest, tearing through his shoulder and collapsing his lung, but he didn't stop. He fired 3 shots from the ground, putting the underboss down permanently, before darkness began to encroach on his vision, the roar of the battle fading into a dull, underwater hum. The return to the mansion was a blur of shouting voices and the copper scent of blood that terrified the staff, but Lily, released from the panic room by a weeping herald, did not scream. She saw Gabriel being carried in on a stretcher, his face gray and his shirt soaked in red, and the fear that had ruled her life for so long suddenly evaporated, replaced by a clarity as sharp as a diamond. She ran to him, ignoring Tony's warnings about the trauma team, and gripped his cold hand as they rushed him through the foyer. "You promised," she sobbed, pressing her forehead against his blood-streaked cheek. "You promised you would fix this." Gabriel's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and dim, but he squeezed her fingers with the last reserves of his strength. "Margaret is safe," he wheezed, blood bubbling past his lips. "Debt paid." Then his hand went limp, and the world dissolved into the chaotic noise of monitors and desperate prayers. 1 year later, the Moretti garden was a riot of white roses and blooming lavender, the scent drifting on a breeze that carried no scent of gunpowder or fear. Chairs were arranged in neat rows on the manicured lawn, filled with associates who had turned legitimate and staff who were now family. Lily stood at the altar, the June sunlight catching the diamonds in her hair, but her eyes were fixed on the man walking down the aisle toward her. Gabriel walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the night he had died and come back to life, but his smile was easy, the shadows under his eyes banished by a year of peace. Ahead of him, Bella and Sophia, now toddling with determined chaos in their fluffy pink dresses, threw flower petals at the guests instead of the ground, eliciting laughter that sounded like music. When Gabriel reached her, taking her hands in his, the scars on both of their souls felt less like wounds and more like a map of the journey that had brought them here. He didn't look like a Mafia don. He looked like a man who had fought a war for his happiness and won. "I, Gabriel," he said, his voice steady and strong, "take you, Lily, to be my wife, my conscience, and my heart. From the darkness into the light, until my last breath." Lily squeezed his hands, tears slipping down her cheeks not from pain, but from an overwhelming gratitude for the broken road that had led her to this moment. "I take you," she whispered, "to love and to heal, to protect and to hold, from this day forward." As they kissed, Harold stood in the back row, closing his worn leather journal on the final entry, wiping a tear from his cheek as he wrote, "The house is no longer silent. The house is a home." This story reminds us that redemption is not a destination you reach by being perfect, but a path you walk by trying to fix what you have broken. Gabriel was a man defined by violence, yet he found his salvation not in power, but in the humble act of loving someone enough to bleed for them. It teaches us that family isn't just about whose blood runs in your veins, but about who is willing to stand in front of the bullet for you when the world catches fire. Lily and Gabriel proved that even the most damaged souls can heal if they are brave enough to trust again, and that sometimes, the people we think we are saving are actually the ones saving us. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story on Sunni romance. We pour our hearts into these tales because we believe in the power of second chances and the beauty of love found in the darkest places. We are dying to know, have you ever had to forgive someone who hurt you deeply, or have you ever been the one begging for a second chance? How did you find the courage to move forward? Please share your heart with us in the comments below. We read every single one, and your stories inspire us more than you know. Wishing you a life filled with love that heals, friends who stay, and a happiness that is worth fighting for. Until next time, take care of your heart.